Lesson 120, Possession. In my books, whenever I introduce some new concept in the foreign language that the book is teaching, I always cover that same concept in English first. And so that's what's happening here in Lesson 120. Soon, you are going to learn how to show possession in ancient Greek. But before we do that, it's a good idea to review how we do it in English so that you can know how to accurately translate it into English and how to actually say the things in English, because it can be kind of tricky, actually, because it involves a couple of potentially tricky rules regarding apostrophes. So to make a long story short, in English, we have two basic ways to indicate that something belongs to someone. Okay, one way is to have an apostrophe and then the letter S at the end of the word that is possessing the thing. So Fred's car, the person possessing the car is Fred. So to show that he is possessing the car, we add an apostrophe and then the letter S. And so we get Fred's. The nation's flag, same thing. We have the word nation, and to show that it's possessing the flag, we add an apostrophe and then the letter S. Arizona's capital, same thing. We add an apostrophe and the letter S to Arizona. So that's one way we show possession in English, is with an apostrophe plus the letter S. The other most common way is using the word of. And as you can see, we have these example sentences: the peak of the mountain, the smell of garlic, the beginning of the show. And we could switch up some of these sentences to use the other method. For example, the ones that use an apostrophe, we could switch those to use the word of. We could say the car of Fred. It sounds kind of clunky. You probably wouldn't talk that way, but it's still understandable. The flag of the nation, well, that sounds perfectly understandable. The capital of Arizona, that actually sounds better than saying Arizona's capital. Likewise, we could switch the others around. The ones that use of, we could switch those to have an apostrophe plus the letter S. So instead of the peak of the mountain, we could say the mountain's peak, and that sounds perfectly fine. Next, we could say garlic's smell. It's a little clunky, and you might not talk like that, but nevertheless, it's perfectly understandable. Lastly, the show's beginning. It's a bit clunky, and you might not talk like that every day. Nevertheless, it is perfectly understandable. You could say, the show's beginning has arrived. So, the basic idea here is that if you want to show that someone is possessing something, you have a choice. You can use an apostrophe plus the letter S, or you can use the word of. Those are your two choices. And basically, one of the two will sound better and more natural. For example, if we're talking about the capital of Arizona, it sounds a bit more natural to say the capital of Arizona rather than to say Arizona's capital. That's just my opinion. I just think it sounds more natural. Or to say the peak of the mountain sounds a little bit more natural than saying the mountain's peak. So as you're translating into English, and as you see a Greek sentence in which someone is possessing something, you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to decide how to translate that possessive kind of construction from Greek into English. So you'll have to pick one of these two methods. Here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes when you have a plural word that's possessing something, sometimes people forget where the apostrophe goes. And so just as a refresher, as a way to help remind you of some of these apostrophe rules, I've put a little chart here so that we can review a couple of the most basic apostrophe rules. So let's go through these together. Rule number 1, to make a noun that does not end in S possessive, just add an apostrophe and an S. Okay, so we have Kate, K-A-T-E, that word does not end with an S, so we want to show that it's Kate's Greek book, that the book belongs to Kate. So we take the word Kate, K-A-T-E, and we add an apostrophe and the letter S. Very simple. The word does not end in S. You add an apostrophe, you add the letter S, and that's it. That's the possessive form. Kate's Greek book. Moving on to rule number 2. To make a singular noun that ends in S possessive, add an apostrophe and an S, just like rule number 1. You might be asking the question, if this is just like rule number 1, why do I have it here? Why have rule number 1 and rule number 2 separate? Here's the reason. Because sometimes some people, some writers, some editors prefer to have just an apostrophe at the end of a word when the word ends with an S. Take the word class. C-L-A-S-S. Class. It's a noun. It ends with the letter S. We want to talk about the class's favorite subject. Okay, so the subject belongs to the class in that sense, or the class is possessing the subject. So we need to make the word for class somehow possessive. I guess we could say the subject of the class, but right now we're examining apostrophes. So the way I'm telling you to do it here is like this. When you have a noun that ends with the letter S, add an apostrophe and then another S. So if you have the word class and you want to show that it's possessing something, you add an apostrophe and then another S. So you get C-L-A-S-S apostrophe S. There are people out there who would just add an apostrophe at the end of the word class, but not the additional S. You will see that sometimes, but what I'm telling you is to go ahead and add the additional S. And in fact, one of the major style guides out there, which is the one I follow, it's called the Chicago Manual of Style. They actually address this issue. So here's a little quote I'll read you from the 16th edition, which is the edition I have here next to my desk. This is on page 355 of the 16th edition. That's section 7.21. It says, some writers and publishers prefer the system, formerly more common, of simply omitting the possessive S on all words ending in S. And then they go on to say, though easy to apply and economical, such usage disregards pronunciation and is therefore not recommended by Chicago, meaning the Chicago Manual of Style. So what I would say is that the way of doing it where you don't add the extra S at the end is sort of falling out of favor. And these style guides, well, at least the Chicago Manual of Style, is specifically saying not to do that. And so for rule number 2, the idea here is that even if a noun ends with the letter S, you go ahead and add an apostrophe and then another S. And so one of the most common places you'll see this practice of people not adding the additional S, you'll see it with people's names. For example, if someone's name ends with the letter S, like for example, Thomas, if they want to say that something belongs to Thomas, they might just say Thomas and then put an apostrophe without the additional S. Another example would be ancient Greek names like Archimedes or Socrates. Those names end with the letter S, and so in print you might see them made into possessives with only just the apostrophe. But again, according to the Chicago Manual of Style, that's falling out of favor, and the better way to do it is to go ahead and add the apostrophe plus an additional S. And then on to rule number 3. What if more than one person or thing is possessing something? What if the word that is doing the possessing is plural? And as we see here in my example sentence for number 3, due to increased interest in Greek, all the books' covers are starting to wear out. That is, the covers of the books. So the word books here is plural. So we have more than one thing possessing something. We have multiple books possessing the covers. So books is a plural noun. How do you show that that plural noun is possessing something? In that particular case, you just add an apostrophe to the end of the word. You do not add an additional S.